Good morning. Thank you very much, Anna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to present the work we have been doing over the last few years under this IMMANA project on understanding the role of value chains in enhancing diets in low-income settings. I'd like to thank my co-presenter Noora Aberman, as well as Jason Donovan and IFPRI, who has been leading the marketing component of this analysis, as well as Amy Margolis at Johns Hopkins and Marco Santa Croce here at IFPRI, as well as colleagues in WFP, both in Rome and in the Malawi office, Save the Children and Chancellor College at the University of Malawi, who really helped to shape this work over the project. We're going to cover a lot of ground in this presentation, starting off with some conceptual work on the links between the value chains and diets, and then talk a little bit about the opportunity we had in terms of applying this new thinking and this conceptual thinking in terms of working with WFP and possibly influencing activities on the ground in Malawi. Then we'll focus on really the meat of the presentation, which is really using new data to talk about the diagnostics to identify the entry points in value chains to improve diets. You'll see that some of the slides are quite dense, and we're going to try and cover as much ground as possible over the next 45 minutes, but we'll inevitably have to be quite quick. So I thought I'd just summarize three of the key things. I think it would be great if you could walk out of the seminar after this. For one, I'd like to really give you a taste of some of the trade-offs that are involved when you start thinking about value chains and the opportunities to improve diets. And two, really the importance of doing some descriptive work to better understand these trade-offs. And three, the benefits of taking a strategic view when addressing these trade-offs. And by strategic view, I kind of mean looking at interventions that can simultaneously address different objectives at the same time. So in terms of the rationale for this work, there's been quite a lot of interest in terms of trying to understand how market-based interventions could be leveraged to improve the diets of low-income populations. And in this context, the value chain framework can provide a useful lens to examine the role of markets within food systems and their potential to improve diets. However, value chains are by nature commodity specific. When we think about diets, we're talking about bundles of foods. And the focus in value chains and value chain analysis has to date really been on efficiency and economic returns, with little explicit focus on consumers and their nutrition and their diets. Moreover, the links between value chains, business environment in which they operate, and nutrition are complex. And there's very little rigorous evidence to help us understand these links. We spent a bit of time as part of the Agriculture for Nutrition and Health research program to try and shape and understand the pathways through which value chain interventions can influence nutrition. And we identified three general pathways. The first leverages demand for nutritious foods. The second focuses on the supply of nutritious foods. And the third focuses on enhancing value chain performance, and is perhaps the only value chain specific type of pathway. The premise for this pathways work is that we recognize that food-related nutritional impacts derive from changes in quality of the overall diet and not just the nutrient content of an individual food. So it's important to keep that in mind whenever you look at this type of framing. Then we use these generalized pathways to think through the potential impact pathways for specific interventions that will be then designed in specific context to examine the potential effectiveness of these interventions. And to facilitate the work around pathways, we use a typology for value chain interventions that is shaped around different contexts and different variations of supply and demand. This slide kind of presents the overall system we are going to look at in particular. And for those of you who are familiar with the Lancet series framework on maternal and childhood nutrition, what we're trying to do here is unpack a little bit the box that focuses on the immediate determinant of undernutrition that involves food intake. if you focused and centrally on the sort of quality of diets for a given target group and potential constraints in these diets that are linked to under or over consumption or suboptimal food and nutrition intake, the idea is that interventions would change these food consumption patterns and improve the quality of diets. By changing food consumption patterns, one can try and shift the food that consumers purchase on the market, or the food that they receive from safety net transfers in the case of low-income households, or the food that they consume from own production. And these are sort of the demand side factors in our framework. Moving on to the supply side of our framework on the right-hand side, here's where we have different value chains for different foods, in this case A, B, and C, where each food value chain has a set of specific characteristics, a set of specific capacities and incentives for the different actors in the chain, and chains operating in specific product, market, and institutional contexts that shape the functioning of the chain. But these chains also provide potentially a new market channel for smallholder producers, a way in which producers can invest in their own production, possibly sell and make more money, more profits out of their sales, and channel more financial resources into their income, which could then be channeled into nutrition and health directly, or influence what food is purchased at the household level. And the interface between supply and demand can really, we term it as the food environment. And 5 particular properties of the food environment provide the link between the quality of diets on the one hand, the consumer end, and value chain performance. These 5 properties involve food availability, the affordability of food, the acceptability, as well as 2 attributes linked to quality, which are nutrient content and food safety risk. And we use variations in the supply and demand in these different types of context to help us identify and let's say put a boundary on the range of possible interventions that can be used to tackle constraints in specific value chains. And this table here summarizes quite a lot of conceptual work we had been doing, where on the sort of y-axis you have variations in demand, on the x-axis you have variations in supply. On the demand side, we're kind of considering sort of optimal demand as the sort of plus green quadrants, and suboptimal demand in the red. And similarly on the supply side, on the green, kind of thinking year-round availability of markets, and on the negative side, where you have constraints in terms of the supply. Now, if you're working or your context is in particularly, for instance, in high demand and adequate supply, or quadrant A, your value chain becomes let's say your business environment, and the transmission of sort of value addition becomes the key constraint that you want to try and optimize. So interventions in this particular space might involve regulatory environment interventions related to food safety, or upgrades in technology to try and make these links across the chains work more efficiently. However, if you're in the low supply and low demand context, here you're trying to sort of develop chains that are not quite existing yet. So you need pretty intensive investments in terms of the supply side to get production and supply going, but at the same time you need to build demand in terms of increasing knowledge of consumers on the particular properties of these foods, and then essentially try and move the context from D to A. But the interventions here in the context of D, for example, are typical for sort of these new biofortified foods that people don't know much about, both in terms of production and consumption. Then you have these 2 quadrants, B and C, where you have an imbalance between demand and supply, and interventions will try and make this balance between the 2 sides. In quadrant B, you have foods that are well known to consumers as being nutritious, but the demand side cannot be matched by the supply. So this examples, for instance, in beans and legumes. And the interventions in this quadrant would be geared around trying to get supply side investments to sort of maybe bring prices down and increase the supply side for those particular foods. Whilst in quadrant C, you have a low demand and an adequate supply. So in this case, interventions would try and work with consumers to try and increase either their knowledge, if knowledge is the binding constraint, or alleviate some of the sort of financial constraints that would translate in the low demand side. So depending on what quadrant you are, you would have a very different set of interventions. And whilst we were developing this conceptual work with stakeholders in the policy and program side, and talking with WFP, we realized there was a really nice opportunity to try and apply some of this thinking in operations. And WFP is really looking to develop strategic linkages between agricultural production on the one hand, private sector processors involved in supply chains, and their social protection transfer programs that they are implementing across countries. In Malawi specifically, WFP has a whole range of transfers that target beneficiaries at different stages of the life cycle. And these can be seen as sort of demand-side interventions, where you have interventions that try and improve nutrition in the first 1,000 days, pregnant lactating women and infants and young children, or you have interventions school-age children like school feeding programs, or you have interventions at the household level like general food distribution or cash and vouchers or food for assets. In addition, in Malawi, WFP has the Purchase for Progress program, where they kind of work with smallholder farmer cooperatives to try and invest in production of foods and provide a new market channel for these specific foods. And they also have experiences with programs that try and link school feeding foods to smallholder-based supply chains. And the idea was to try and investigate these links on the demand and supply side more systematically. And the starting point for this examination is really a set of diagnostics that were really aimed to identifying the links between a set of nutrition problems in a specific target population and link those to constraints in the supply and demand of specific foods that could then be potentially addressed by intervention. These diagnostics have been around for quite a while. If you look at the work by Timmer and Falcon in the 1980s, key parts of sort of food policy analysis, but they start by understanding the nutrition problem, then working to examine the enabling environment and the macro level food system context, and use that as an entry point to understand what people are eating, essentially characterizing dietary patterns, looking at what foods are being eaten, what foods might be missing from diets, and how these foods translate to nutrient intakes and potential gaps or overconsumption of specific foods that can be then used to identify the relative contribution of different foods in the whole diet. And use that as the entry point for your value chain analysis, really, which is step 4, which really tries to focus on the specific constraints and opportunities in specific value chains and relate those back to those dietary constraints. And in step 5, really using this analysis to prioritize the interventions in maybe some of these different quadrants that we just talked about a few slides ago, to identify, which investments would make sense or which package of interventions make sense. And in these next slides that Noora will talk about, we will focus on steps 3, 4, and 5. So I'll hand over to Noora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aulo. It's Anna here. I'll now make Noora the presenter, and Noora, you can now share your screen with the audience. And Noora, please unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Aulo. Thanks, Anna. So I'll now jump into the country context. Just one sec, there we are. Okay, so all of this diagnostic work took place in Malawi, which is a low-income food deficit country and high rates of undernutrition. We have stunting at 37%, wasting at 3%, and with diets, sort of low-quality diets as well. So 8% of children up to age 2 meet the minimum acceptable diet. 36% of children are anemic, and then similarly 33% of women are anemic. we find malaria is endemic and in particular affects children under 5 at 33%. HIV is also somewhat high prevalence, and this is all in the context of recurrent severe seasonal food shortages. Now, our study setting was in the southern region of Malawi from the Zomba district, where data was collected from 60 communities, randomly selected from among a set of food insecure villages. And this was all in the context of an ongoing randomized controlled trial. Seasonality and prices are sort of a recurrent issue, annual issue. So you can see here the rainy season from approximately November through March. We have one rainy season, so unimodal production cycle. There's a main harvest from April through August and a little bit of winter harvest, but for the most part just in flood areas, very little irrigation. So for the most part, it's a unimodal production cycle that leads to high seasonal prices and food availability and also lumpy income for farmers. Markets are quite thin, and there's a maize-heavy food preference that I'll talk about in a bit. So the methods for this study were mixed methods descriptive approach based on 2 rounds of data collection. Firstly, there's a panel of 1,200 households, including 7-day recall food consumption module. Data was collected kind of late after the harvest season and then in the depths of the lean season. In-depth individual interviews were also undertaken, 56 in-depth interviews from out of this same sample of the 1,200 households and 27 structured direct household observations. And then in addition, market surveys were undertaken in the 5 main markets in the Zomba district. And so this in-depth market study entailed structured interviews with 47 traders, some semi-structured interviews with government agencies, businesses, and traders. And this happened in the lean season only. So now moving into the findings, characterizing diets, as Aulo just talked about. The data from the 7-day recall of household food consumption and expenditures suggests that low-income households face important deficits in nutrient intake. If we look at the orange and yellow bars, these represent all households, and we can see that from orange to yellow there are significant declines in consumption of these key nutrients from the post-harvest season to the lean season. Whereas if we look at the lowest, the poorest quintiles, there's very little change, and this really just indicates how poor many people's diets are all year round. Now, once again, looking at food consumption patterns across the seasons, we have the larger pie charts show all households, lean season and post-harvest, and then the lowest quintile is represented in the smaller pie charts. The first thing that stands out is that food consumption is indeed dominated by maize. We see that across all households, there's about 1 kilogram of food consumed per day per person, but that decreases to about 40% for those in the lowest expenditure quintile. From the qualitative data, we examined food preferences generally, and then also in particular in terms of coping through the lean season. The quote on the top says, "Food is maize, but others require money." So it shows the sort of dominance of maize as how people define food security. So in spite of that, having a diverse diet is highly valued. People do prefer having, for instance, different types of relishes, which is usually made up of some greens or pulses, or if you can afford it, animal foods that you would dip your maize meal into. But there is this maize first preference, so combining that with financial limitations and seasonal availability, this really hampers diet diversity. And deprivation or food insecurity is gauged in terms of maize access. Now, pulses are commonly described as a sort of a store of wealth. So if enough was harvested, then they're sold for cash when cash is needed, or sold to be able to purchase maize once people run out of maize. And so they're not prioritized as much in terms of a food source. Meat is rarely eaten due to financial limitations as well as due to sharing norms, because if an animal is slaughtered, then you have to share that with the villagers, and so people prefer to wait until there's just generally more food around. And vegetables and fruits are highly seasonal and so tend to only be eaten in season. Now, in terms of coping with the lean season, people eat less and less preferred foods, though sometimes the foods that they choose to eat are more nutrient dense, like in the case of eating avocado as a coping food. Non-maize meals are not considered food, but often used to soothe children. So sweet potato, mango, avocado are often used to kind of keep a child from crying of hunger, but not seen as food or not seen as somebody having eaten a meal. There's also a buy-as-you-go approach to filling maize needs that is somewhat expensive, because people will basically do what they can a given week or a given day to earn the money to buy enough maize to be able to eat that day. All right, so this shows the contributions of foods to nutrient intake across seasons and sourcing patterns. So whether the food is from own consumption or from production. And generally what we see is that the, I can show you, here's the lean season and the post-harvest season. So I'll show lean season for a moment and then move to, I'll show post-harvest for a moment and move to lean season. So what we see generally is that the patterns don't change much by season. Maize certainly dominates in terms of intake and in terms of the nutrients provided by any given food. And while other nutritious foods are definitely being consumed, like leafy greens, fruits, chicken, dried fish, these are in very, very small amounts. Except when we look at for vitamin A. I'll move over to the lean season. So the share consumed from own production, while the patterns of in terms of maize consumption doesn't change much, what we see is a significant difference in terms of the share consumed from own production as people run out of their maize stocks and then are purchasing on the market if they can afford it. One sort of exception is leafy greens, where in the rainy season leafy greens are growing, and so people are consuming leafy greens from own consumption, and that does provide quite a bit of their vitamin A during the lean season. All right, so I think this is where I hand over to Aulo.
Thank you, Noora. Thanks very much. Yeah, so Anna, I'm wondering whether, yeah, there we go, perfect. So what we then tried to do using the household survey data and the market survey data was explore this sort of different role of markets by seasons. And one way we did that was to sort of combine data on food consumption with data from prices to get an idea of what, how efficiently, let's say, the market could deliver a bundle of nutrients at those two different times of the year. And so we looked at what people consumed at those two different points and the price that they would have had to pay for those consumption bundles, right? And essentially developed a series of cost efficiency metrics, so the price per specific nutrient. And this is what you're seeing in those two tables, on a single table with this sort of two columns, one for the baseline during post-harvest when prices are kind of lowest, and there's more food available, I guess, at household level in terms of maize, and the lean season where prices peaked. And what we tried to do is sort of look at it both from a single nutrient perspective, but also from, we tried to develop a nutrient index that kind of tried to aggregate the value of consumption for these bundles of foods that people were consuming at different points and priced those essentially. And use that as a way to kind of give us or confirm in some ways that, markets, the role of markets does change, and in some ways markets are less efficient in terms of providing nutrients at the peak lean season. This is ongoing work that we're doing with John Arsenault, and we hope to develop this further, particularly when looking at metrics. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what the thinking of this was. In terms of the market analysis, and this is the component that Jason Donovan led, what we were trying to do is, so moving on from what Noora was saying, in terms of, we've identified the foods that are important in terms of the nutrient intake, but also foods that are potentially missing, right? And like the animal source foods, which we saw were consumed, but in very low amounts. So the next step was really to focus on these nutritious foods and look at the role of markets and the role of what the different value chains for these specific foods look like in the study population. As Noora said, we focus on the 5 main markets in Zomba and use semi-structured interviews with traders and other value chain actors, and we focused on the 6 chains that we identified in the food consumption analysis. This table summarizes the profiles of the different traders we talked about, we interviewed, and most of them were female and quite spread out around the different commodities. These commodities were chicken, ground nuts, beans and peas, avocado, dried fish, and leafy greens. What we tried to do, so for each specific commodity, was to get a sense of the year-round availability in local markets. So we tried to develop these sort of seasonal calendars where we tried to, engage with the different traders, a sense of where were the periods of sort of peak volume sales, as well as peak prices, and in terms of issues related to supply, and also issues related to demand. And these are sort of summarized in these pictures that can actually give you a sense of this seasonality at play. So for leafy greens, demand was particularly low during the early months of the year. Mostly because, as we saw from the earlier household level data, households actually produce these leafy greens in their own gardens. The demand on the market picks up mid-year as income improves post-harvest, when maize has been harvested and stocks from the own gardens dwindle. Sellers who are also growers and without irrigation, so have a small window in which to sell these greens, which runs from January to April, and demand is greatest towards the end of the year, when price increases range from about 25 to 50% during the periods of peak demand. For fruits, in particular avocado, like Noora was saying, sales are marked by very strong seasonality and large variations in price. For most of the year, there's little avocado on the market, and avocados begin to appear just before the major maize harvest, when rural households have limited financial resources to be able to purchase these foods. Sales peak in April-May after the harvest, and then collapse as avocados go out of season. Small amounts of avocado may appear after May, but these are sold mostly by traders who have access to food from these fruits from different regions, and prices can vary from about 100% to 300% during the short production season. And mango follows a very similar seasonality trend with a slightly different start period, but a very similar trend. Now, in terms of animal source foods, we had some very interesting findings, mostly to do with dried fish, which is available year-round. The fish harvest generally declined during the hottest month of the year. Most fish are actually purchased from intermediaries, so directly from fishermen in Lake Malawi and Lake Chihuahua. If you remember from the map that Noora showed earlier on, these 2 lakes were within sort of 200-kilometer radius from the study population. Demand is lowest between February and March, reflecting the abundant in fish stocks and lack of income by rural households. Once again, following the maize harvest in April, demand picks up, with the months of June and July being the peak selling periods, and prices varying markedly by season, by fish type, by size, availability, and other factors, with prices fluctuating between 25 and 200% during the year. The interesting part was that the different varieties of fish included these very small but highly nutritious fish that were sort of affordable enough for low-income consumers to buy. And these definitely provided an entry point that we'll explore a little later in terms of potential interventions. In terms of chickens, they were available throughout the year through local traders, but demand is pretty limited throughout the whole year. Households tend to purchase more chicken following the maize harvest when they have more money between April and July, and demand kind of peaks in December as households purchase chicken for the end of year festivities. Prices roughly vary between 75 and 100% during the peak season compared to the off season. Now for legumes, dried beans and peas, these are available throughout the year, and the demand peaking in the months following the maize harvest once again at the end of the year. Traders purchase beans following the harvest and store them or purchase them from traders in the central region or in neighboring Mozambique. Prices for red beans vary between 25 and 50% during the year. And similarly, groundnut is available throughout the whole year, and with demand growing during the final quarter as rural households have consumed most of their own production and seek to purchase the seed for the next year's production. And prices vary considerably between the peak season and the off season, by about 300% actually. So in this slide, we tried to summarize the value chain, I guess, structures for the different commodities we explored. We have chain reach, the actors involved, the input and service utilized by chain actors, and the level of processing involved. And most of these chains, so for leafy greens, avocados, and live chickens, we are talking about really short localized chains surrounding the villages where producers are or market traders in the villages are involved in the sale, with very little value addition and value chain activities per se. Now, when you talk about dried fish, we're trying to talk about slightly longer chains, so regional level, linking the shores of Lake Malawi and Lake Chihuahua. The actors are involved the fishermen, the local and regional traders. No activities in terms of inputs or supply chain services. However, there is some level of processing more in terms of drying and smoking the fish that are then available on the market. For beans, peas, and groundnuts, we're talking about now slightly longer chains. They're regional or can actually link to the international markets. The actors involve producers and traders and processors in the case of groundnuts. Activities involve transportation and storage and drying in the case of beans and peas. But for groundnuts involve quite an interesting set of activities involving value addition that's relevant to nutrition, including the development of processed peanut-based products for the national and international markets. And the main challenges that the groundnut chain faces in Malawi is linked to storage, marketing, but also aflatoxin control, which is a major problem. In terms of the challenges, let me just check that yes. In terms of the challenges that the traders faced, Noora, is this some slides? Do you want to talk about these slides, or should I continue?
I think that's fine. Do you want to continue and then I can do the closing slides?
Sure, let me do that. Sorry about that. I just realized
No, that's fine. It's okay.
So the biggest marketing challenges were really linked to the low demand and excess supply that we reported on earlier. So these market interviews really showed that these foods were a range of highly nutritious foods were available on the market, but there was very little action. So consumers were not really able to purchase any of these foods during the lean season.
Aulo, we cannot hear you at the moment.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry, Anna.
perhaps if you could start on that slide again, the current, I think this one's fine, the following one, if you could just pick up from there, the other challenge.
So sorry. So sorry. I was just saying the inadequate, sort of very low level of market infrastructure and capacity reflected in sort of a lack of clean water and toilets, lack of overall infrastructure for storage and selling, weak coordination among sellers and producers. In this picture you can see sort of the greens, leafy green vegetables are being sold right under the sun. That would, whilst there is a shed available, it was clearly not being used, and sort of the perishability of the products was really evident. And there's really limited evidence of product differentiation based on origin, quality, or other attributes. I'll just talk about this slide and then hand over to you, Noora, if that's all right. So this table here is extremely busy, but all it is really that 2x2 table that we presented in the introduction, where we tried to use data from our diagnostic to populate it for the different foods. So the first column, you have the dietary change that we would like to focus on in terms of the specific commodities that we prioritized in our assessment. So in this case, we have groundnuts that are consumed throughout the year, but the high levels of aflatoxin and contamination are a major health risk. That's the sort of constraint with regards to groundnuts. With regards to bean and legumes that are consumed in low volumes, so the idea would be to try and increase this consumption to improve dietary intake and dietary quality. So for animal source foods, especially dried fish and for leafy greens, these foods are available for consumption, but consumption is low. We need to try and improve the consumption quantities to improve diet quality. For nutritious foods, fruits like mangoes and avocados, they're consumed in inadequate amounts, but are not consumed in adequate amount throughout the year because of supply side and demand side constraints. But increasing the consumption will improve diet quality. So those are the sort of entry points in terms of the dietary analysis. So for groundnuts, we're talking about quadrant A, where there is a supply and there is a demand in place, but there are linkages in between demand and supply across the chain that are a major constraint in terms of the potential to achieve nutrition, improved nutrition and diet. So in this sense, consumers are willing and able to purchase, and there's high availability in the markets throughout the year. In terms of the consumer-related issues, we're talking about sorting and grading likely to result in low-income consumers exposed to foods with higher levels of aflatoxin. So in this case, households tend to sort out the low-quality or contaminated maize and keep it for their own consumption and sell the high-quality, the higher quality maize on the market, making the sort of risks for their health much higher. And the main constraints we're talking in this chain are linked to the sort of gaps in the regulatory environments and quality assurance for that particular chain, and limited capacity and weak incentives for smallholders to invest to improve production practices. So in this context, the intervention is really around developing and testing third-party quality assurance mechanisms and strengthening the capacity of processes to minimize food safety concerns. So fairly hefty and tricky investments that the stakeholders in Malawi have been trying to address for over a period of years. Now for beans, we're talking about a context there where there's a high demand and low supply, so consumers are willing to prioritize the purchase of food when funds are available, but there's limited availability in specific parts of the year. The consumer-related issues relate to the willingness to purchase and prioritize over other foods, except for maize, and consumers have limited purchasing capacity during peak demand periods. So the production bottlenecks limit the availability during periods of the year, and there are limited incentives for traders to engage in supplying local markets if consumers can't afford to pay. Innovation in production technologies to expand the availability would make sense in this context, as well as improving coordination and other measures like storage with traders that would reduce costs and hopefully prices at peak times in the year. For these animal source foods and leafy greens that were missing and or consumption is particularly low, This is despite these foods being available on the market. So we're talking about low demand and high supply quadrant in our matrix. These are preferred foods in the case of animal source foods, but there's low willingness to pay, mainly due to financial constraints. However, for the leafy greens, these are often considered not preferred or coping foods, like Noora was saying. So despite them being very nutritious, they are not being consumed in adequate amounts despite there being a supply. So producers and sellers have limited opportunities to expand or add value to their production due to limited effective demand. So in this particular context, the interventions would involve trying to increase this pull mechanism, increase the demand side, either by providing sort of social transfers to facilitate consumption in critical periods like the lean season, through like public programs like vouchers or school feeding programs or other types of subsidies to reduce price, or provide support to chain actors to reduce the cost of production and trading. But for these wild foods, information alone could provide some benefits to increase the acceptability of these particular foods. In terms of quadrant D, so we're talking about the nutritious foods like the mangoes and the avocados. Here we have low consumption and also low supply at particular seasons because of the high seasonal availability. There's also, in terms of consumers, a low willingness to pay for these fruits, with preferences towards consumption of maize. And fruits tend to be relatively expensive during off-peak season, making it difficult for consumers to afford. In terms of the main constraints in those chains is lack of storage and transports, and the highly perishable goods that we're talking about. And the limited demand on the market increases the risk for supply-side developments and other type of investments. So few processors and distributors are engaged in this sector. In terms of interventions, that would make sense in this context. We're talking about information campaigns to increase acceptability, interventions to support chain actors to improve storage or extend shelf life of these perishable foods, investments in these local marketing infrastructures that we saw that were very weak, but on the same side, try and invest on the demand side, like in quadrant C, where we'd have interventions, public type of interventions, combining sort of subsidies or social transfers to facilitate this consumption when prices are when consumers are priced out, let's say. Noora, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, great. So I'll just wait. Oh, here we are. Good. I can show my screen. So we have just a few more wrapping up slides, and I'll try to go through them a bit quickly since we're a bit out of time. So summing up, in the lean season, people have essentially no purchasing power. So households are highly constrained in terms of what food they can access and cash. So there's little room to maneuver in their diets. Buying power is constrained, so there's little sort of pull effect that we can affect. So in this type of situation, it's likely that more information isn't going to change people's eating patterns. However, there are some lean season interventions that have potential. So we can promote underutilized foods through large-scale lean season interventions to address the pull and the push. For instance, supplying avocado in school meals or providing vouchers for purchasing leafy greens. And I'm sorry, we have an acronym here that others outside of Malawi won't maybe recognize, but this is through the annual, unfortunately, annual humanitarian response where legumes and maize is provided. However, outside the lean season, financial constraints are loosened, so there's some more room to influence food consumption patterns. Now, it's in this situation that we could promote behavior change to, for instance, increase acceptability and consumption of underutilized foods. Those that aren't typically preferred, for instance, by fortified foods, drought-tolerant foods, local wild greens that are prevalent, and also providing education about the benefits and how to prepare these. we can look for instance, support to production to increase the time period for which leafy greens are available into the months when people can actually afford them. This could happen through inputs, simple irrigation approaches, etc. Now, that's just to give a sense of the types of interventions we can consider based on this, this diagnostic tool. Now, we've actually piloted 2 different interventions in Malawi, and so we'll just give a snapshot of the results that came out of it. So firstly, looking at the effects of lean season food transfers on food security, diets, and nutrition. This was out of this same sample in Zomba using a quasi-experimental design. We found that food transfers actually increased calories and nutrient consumption at the household level, that the effects were driven by consumption of foods other than those that were provided in the transfer. Also had a beneficial effect on dietary diversity of young children, and that these effects were concentrated in poor households. Another intervention that was piloted through randomized control trial was the impact of agriculture nutrition training and input provision on diets, food security, and production. So seeds and vines for nutritious foods were provided, and training to improve household production diversity and children's dietary diversity. And as expected, the effects were driven by increases in planting legumes and roots and tubers, specifically orange flesh sweet potato. But unexpectedly, the effect of the ag intervention on dietary diversity for young children occurred even before the nutrition training had started, and this was driven by increased consumption of fruits. So what are the outcomes of this? So essentially, different seasons call for different support. The results point to this need for a layered approach to interventions and the complementary role of different interventions. In this instance, lean season food transfers to smoothen consumption and protect vulnerable households from seasonal price spikes. So now we're looking at quadrant C, and also this ag nutrition inputs and training that promotes longer-term investments and shaping of supply in addition to demand for nutritious foods. And so now we're looking at quadrant B. So a strategy for interventions could be framed around enhancing consumption in low-income households of a basket of nutritious foods. Objectives could be framed around sort of specific food chains, or what are the constraints in specific food chains, factors in seasonality, and that there are also roles for public and private sectors. So finally, some important questions do remain. What are the costs, the relative costs of these strategies and interventions? Are the impacts sustained? And I'm afraid for the spoiler alert, Aulo will have to tell you what that is, because I'm not sure. But that's the end of our presentation.
Thanks, Noora. And if I could just jump in there and say, you know, as Noora was saying, when we were comparing food transfers and this sort of information intervention, so one was through a quasi-experiment and the other was through an RCT, we had similar effects in terms of changing or improving diets if we look at dietary diversity. But the size of the effect was much bigger in the case of food transfers. So I think the effect was about 0.4 standard deviations if you looked at the food transfer, compared to a 0.2 standard deviation of just providing information. However, that effect was measured at 6 months, and we went back at 12 months and looked at the effects of not just information, but the full ag nutrition intervention. So by that time, the inputs that had been provided had been planted and had been harvested. So at 12 months, the effects of the ag nutrition intervention exposed to an RCT on diets were huge, much bigger than they were at the lean season, and bigger than they were for the food transfers. And we also picked up an effect on the nutrition status of kids as well. So just to reinforce what Noora was saying, it's really important to try and look at the complementarity between different interventions across these complex systems where we have different feedbacks and different trade-offs that you have to manage. And some interventions would make sense on the short term, other interventions make sense on the longer term, but combining these short-term and long-term perspectives can give you a sort of strategic approach to try and tackle undernutrition and malnutrition more broadly. I guess that's it from us. So thanks very much for your patience, and over to you. Let me just acknowledge first, actually, the large team that really helped on this work, including IFPRI, people at IFPRI, at WFP, at Save the Children, Chancellor College, the investments by IMMANA and the NEEP funds, the CGIR program, and of course the very patient research participants, which coped with our huge household surveys that we've been running in the study population. Thank you very much.